Welcome to On Cloud, the podcast for cloud professionals, where we break down the state of cloud computing today and how you can unleash the power of cloud for your enterprise. Now, here's your host, Mike Cavus.
Hey everyone, welcome back on Cloud Podcast, where we get real about cloud technology. We discuss all the hot topics around cloud computing and AI, but most importantly, with the people in the field who do the work every day. I'm Mike Cavus, your host and chief cloud architect over at Deloitte. Today I'm joined by good friend John Willis, aka Botchagloop, and John is the author of 12 books and is a legend in the DevOps and cloud space. And if you don't know John, at the end of this show, we will share his information, and you need to read all this stuff and watch his videos. It's really great. So, John, before we get going, it has been almost 5 years since we last did a podcast, and I was trying to go back in time to see when we did our first one. I think it was around 2008 or 9. So we've been chatting for a long time, and it's good to see you and hear from you again. And since I got you today, we're going to focus on your new book, Deming's Journey to Profound Knowledge, and then we're going to record on the intersection of DevOps and AI. So for this one, let's dig right in and tell us, what inspired you. Well, first of all, what's this book about, and what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, I think, Mike, it's been a great, I don't know if you remember when we first met, you were one of the first successful commercial implementations of a product built on Amazon, as far as I know. And I had a pretty good universe, and you reached out to me as a consultant. I'm like, man, I'm just learning this stuff. And you're like, so am I. And I helped you a little bit on your design and architecture. But yeah, and that was like crazy years
2008,
ago.
Man. 2008.
Yeah, there you go, man. That's pretty crazy. As you said, and we've known each other for a while, I've sort of gotten into a lot of things, early cloud, that nonsense, what some people called some of us clouderati, right? But pretty soon into that, I got back to my roots. Cloud was interesting, but I've always been an ops person, systems administration, and DevOps sort of exploded, right? And DevOps has been very, very good to me, right? Through going to the first DevOps days, and then Damon Edwards, who's one of my primary partners in crime, and when it comes to sort of DevOps, almost all things, we ran the first DevOps days in the US. And what happened was Damon invited Gene Kim to come to that event. That was in 2010. And I was on a panel, and I knew Gene, but I guess I just didn't know what he looked like. And sometimes I'm just like, go here, be on this panel, do this. And I'm on the panel, and I'm having a conversation with Gene, and I get off the panel, and Damon says, you know who that was? Because Damon knew I was a big fan of Gene's Visible Ops, and Gene in operations was sort of a god, right? And he goes, do you know who that was sitting next to you? And I'm like, I don't know, panel guy number 4. And he's like, no, that was Gene Kim. I'm like, oh my goodness. And I literally race around the conference to find him, and he's already gone. And so we agreed to meet at South by Southwest that sort of only a month or so later, I think it was. And we met, we had coffee, and anybody who meets Gene, they realize what a beautiful human, right? He just like genuinely wants to help people. And we're going through all that, and then he tells me about his book that he's writing. The book is The Phoenix Project. And I asked for an early copy, like I'd love to get involved. We even started talking about writing a companion book, which sort of evolved into the DevOps Handbook, which I'm co-author with him. And he said, well, you know what? I think you really should read this book first. It was a book by Elliot Gorak called The Goal, which is a classic industrial engineering book. I'm like, all right, yeah, sure. And I read The Goal, and I was like, oh my goodness, this guy is in my soul, Elliot Gorak. And so I just consumed his work. And I became a big fan. And then eventually Gene gave me one of the early versions of the Phoenix Project and read it. And for those who don't know, Gene purposely wrote a modern day rewrite of The Goal, the Phoenix Project, which is sort of a modern implementation. But the story was methodically designed to be the same story, sort of a Goldradian model of storytelling. And long story short, we ran the second DevOps days in the US. Now, this place, I'm considered an Goldrad expert, and I've wanted a few people on the planet actually read the early version of the Phoenix Project, so I've got this down. And we're running an open spaces on theory of constraints, which is one of Goldratt's primary ideas or methodologies or philosophies, I guess. I don't know, pick one. And a guy named Ben Rockwood, who I'm a huge fan of. He's incredible, well-read on operations research. he runs this thread on theory constraints, and Deming comes up. And Ben says, "Oh, John, by the way, this all goes back to Deming." I'm like, "No, man, Go-Rat, man, don't confuse me. Like I'm a Go-Rat fan. I don't want to hear about this guy." And he challenges me, just like Gene challenged me. He said, "You really should go look at Deming's 14 points." And I Googled it, and I sort of went and I looked, and I was like, "Oh my God, this guy is spouting the essence of DevOps." And what's interesting is he was doing it 50 years before DevOps. If you think about how revolutionary DevOps was changing the way work habits went in IT between developers and operations and silos. And this guy was talking about this kind of stuff at least 50 years ago before DevOps was sort of coined. And I was like, all right, well, now I'm going to really dive into this guy because this is fascinating. And then, no disrespect to Go-Rat, and I'm still a huge fan of it, but Deming was it's like opening up Pandora's box. And I decided to create a presentation, another recommendation by Ben Rockwood, and I called it Deming to DevOps, which I wanted to go through sort of the history of how did this guy learn and think about this stuff that ultimately was lean, agile, DevOps. And that was an incredible journey. I did some early presentations, and then I had this idea with Gene, because Elliot Go-Rat did a audio-only book 20 years after we were at the goal, and he called it Beyond the Goal. And I pinged Gene. It was about 5 years after the Phoenix Project been out. I said, we should do a Beyond the Phoenix Project. And Gene loved the idea, and it's a book. It's one of my sort of 12 books, if you will. And I covered in depth Deming. He covered Go-Rat. He covered the why. If you haven't listened to the book, it's a fabulous book. That Gene gets into how Go-Rat came up with the book, how they architected the Phoenix Project. Anyway, another long story short, Gene told me at that point, "Hey, you should write a book about Dr. Deming." And I put it in my back pocket. I started accumulating all these great stories over the years, sort of get a little serious, do some research, create some directories, some files. And then along comes the pandemic, and I realized you've been working on this thing, and are you ever going to write it? And then I thought, the pandemic, if I'm ever going to write, if I can't do it now during the pandemic, because I was getting back like 100, 150 hours a month from travel that I wasn't traveling, because I travel quite a bit. And as I did some research, I found some really good editors, helped me find some people, some great consultants, primarily a great consultant who's attributed for helping write the book, Derek Lewis. And during the pandemic, I wrote the book. All during my research, I found these great stories, and every book written about Deming was so formulaic. It was basically a little bit about his biography, and then all about that author's ideas about Deming's theories. I mean, good books for Deming's theories, but I thought there were such great stories. I was finding the people he worked with, people he met, people he influenced, people who influenced him. And I'm a big fan of Michael Lewis, Moneyball, The Big Short, Flash Boys, right? They're biographies that you don't know that they're biographies. And they can teach my mother-in-law or sort of an operations or a day trader the same narrative. They just learn it differently. I thought, man, if I could write a book in Michael Lewis style about this guy, because he's got great stories, and there's some complexity in his ideas, or simplistic complexity, which is a Go-Rat theme, right? That some of the most complex things are actually really simple. And I'm going to do this. And I spent a solid year writing the book, and then took probably another 18 months to get it. When you think you're done with a book, there's a whole nother world of, revisions. I had 8, 9 revisions, and then there's sort of going through the edit process. But ultimately, it came out last August, the audio and so ebook, and in January, the paperback came out. So it's been a great ride. It's one and more, other than my kids and my wife, probably one of the most fascinating things I've done in my life.
Man, it's coming up on a year already. That's amazing. I've written 2, and I don't know how you write 12. Like you said, you're almost never done, right? It's just so much work. So hats off on that. So now that we got the background on that, can you one of the topics in there is the 4 components of Deming's system of profound knowledge. and their relevance to today's management practices. So keep in mind that a lot of the audience may not know anything about Deming. So,
Sure.
make that simple and explain that to us.
That's a good point. Yeah. So just to give you the heads up on Deming, it's called System of Profound Knowledge, which, like, at this point, if you've never heard of Deming, like, who is this guy calling his idea profound knowledge? But he's very particular about his words, and it didn't mean it in an egotistical way. He meant it in that there's this body of knowledge that if you can harness it, and what the interesting thing about who he is and what he did is like sort of a really cool story. One is you might know him through quotes. I mean, the sort of the data quotes, and God we trust, all others bring data. I mean, you've heard his quotes. You may not remember that's him. He's usually attributed as the person who was sent to Japan after World War II by MacArthur. It's a much more expansive story. It's not that simple. NBC does this documentary, and this is how I start my book on this story because it's fascinating. It's called If Japan Can, Why Can't We? And it's this whole thing about Japan, what they did after World War II, how they sort of revolutionized their ideas and concept for manufacturing. Ultimately it gets coined as lean at some point a little later after this documentary. And then all of a sudden, the whole TQM, total quality movement, gets born based on this documentary. Again, I'm putting it in very simple terms. The book goes into a lot more complexities of this narrative. Anyway, so the principles behind these ideas that he used during World War II, to help us win the war, the quality movement during the war, which is actually most is classified, and then what the revolution that put America back competitive is basically based on this idea that he wrote about in his last book called System of Profound Knowledge. But the other thing that was fascinating to Deming is he was writing about complex systems and complexity, and the truth of the matter in the 50s. Like when he goes to Japan and helps Japan, he says the same thing to them. If you follow my ideas, you will be a world economic power in 5 years. And they do. And the principles behind this is the idea, like, again, he understood complexity and systems thinking in the 40s and 50s. If you think about the science behind complexity science, I mean, most of the real research starts happening in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s with Lorentz, the butterfly effect, all that stuff, right? Deming's like talking about this stuff in the 40s and 50s, right? And what he said is, in order to understand complexity, you think of it like a camera. Like to take a perfect picture, you have multiple elements of a lens, right? One is aperture, the light exposure. One is depth. One is not depth. And he said, so like, how do you take a perfect picture, right? It's a complexity. Like in my book, I use the kiss, right? The famous kiss after World War II, where the sailor grabs the nurse and he kisses. That's a perfect picture. That isn't just happenstance. It doesn't like just click. A great photographer tries to get the right exposure, get the right focus, the right depth. How do you get the faces, right? And so Deming said that when you're dealing with complexity in sort of everything, you need to think of complexity of using a lens, and he called this thing System of Profound Knowledge, which is made up of 4 elements. And I'll run through them really quickly. In the book, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out where he got all this from, because he didn't invent any of this stuff. So the first element is what they call theory of knowledge. We know this as scientific thinking, scientific method. It's how do we know what we think we know? If we know anything about like DevOps, lean, agile, right? We know the biggest mistakes we make are biases, where we believe something works a certain way. We don't test it. Like I've seen that before. Let me do this. Been numerous sort of accidents and postmortems on plane crashes and stuff that talk all about this stuff, right? So the idea that you really try to understand that you don't know, you have a hypothesis, you have an idea, but like just eradicate that idea that you think that you know what it is, right? Like, and so again, the scientific method, back to epistemology, you can think of it as correlation versus causation, right? So when we have these sort of biases or correlation, we look for sort of patterns to say this causes this. Okay, I know what it is, as opposed to causation, or more, maybe specifically difference between inductive or deductive reasoning. Anyway, that's knowledge. There's a lot there. The second element of this complexity lens, system of profound knowledge, is understanding variation. And at the core, like the way we build toasters and nuclear power plants uses these ideas based on statistical process control and control charts. Unfortunately, we don't do any of it in IT, which is sort of disheartening. And the idea then is, how do we understand what we think we found out, right? And it's all through statistical models and something called analytical statistics. And at its core, it's the ability to separate the data from the process. So now you can decouple the bias. I'm just going to show you data, statistical patterns of data. And again, this stuff, if it sounds like, wow, this guy, what is he talking about? I mean, the way your nuclear power plants, the way your toaster, the way your car was created, all use this technology, right? And so there are patterns that have been developed over 100 years that basically say if the data looks like this and it's between an upper and lower control limit and it has these patterns, there is something not right. And it's mind-blowingly simple, but it's like it uncouples unbelievable complexity, because now you're able to have statisticians or analytical statisticians look at data, turn it over to subject matter experts and say, the data is telling us something here. What does it mean to you? Oh my goodness, that's when we changed the such and such. We updated version 3 to 4. All right, third piece, psychology. And this is where it gets really brilliant, because the first two are more technology, but the fact that he added in this idea of psychology, and again, this is the third of the fourth lens, is understanding motivation, understanding decoupling biases, right? And then you start seeing them all merge together. You know, epistemology or a theory of knowledge, looking at sort of analytical statistics to sort of uncouple what the data and what the things that might be happening in the real world might be software. But now we're adding in okay, the human is involved in this complex system, and humans have, sort of, we'll call them frailties or biases, or we're sort of weird animals, right? We sort of decouple us sometimes from an organizational behavior structure as intrinsic versus extrinsic. Truth of the matter is not binary. Intrinsic motivation actually has 8 or 9 psychological classifications. So sometimes we say, oh, this is simple. I just look for my intrinsically motivated employees and I treat them that way. And I look for my extrinsically motivated employees, and like easy as pie. And, and I try to go into that a little bit. But the point is, you're applying that additional element into the lens, like the aperture or the depth. And then last, but certainly not least, is appreciation system, which is systems thinking. So you put all this together. If you know anything about system thinking, right, it's sort of working inside out. There's always a bigger piece to sort of look at. How does what I do, if I make a local optimization here, am I looking at the global effect or global optimization? So that, as quick as I can do it. But again, if you're really interested, I would definitely read the book. But that is System of Profound Knowledge.
So the question with all that is, yourself and Gene and Damon and all these guys who started, championing this DevOps movement. How do you take all those things that you said, which are making successful manufacturing companies, and apply it to successful software building?
Yeah, what's interesting is you see all these elements all over, all these successful implementations and success stories around DevOps, because there's two things that are consistent to every successful, and all four have to be sort of knitted together to work at optimum. But two that I like are clear is basically systems thinking. Like, if we've learned anything about how we optimize things, you think of a software supply chain, right? If we just go in and optimize one piece of it, and this is what the Phoenix Project is written about, right? Theory constraints. Right. Like, you can't just change one thing and not realize other things might be affected. Or, the idea that sometimes in a global organization, some parts of the organization have to be suboptimal to make the aggregate optimal, right? Like these are hard concepts. So that's a very simplistic way of sort of describing some of the benefits of systems thinking. And then on the book end, sort of front end, which is, how we think about what we do. Do we just make rash decisions or, sort of knee-jerk decisions about like we get a breach? And there was a bank one time that I worked with, they had a breach and the CEO ordered them to put a rec out for 150 new IT security people. But the point is, you don't even know why the breach happened, where the breach happened, what all that stuff is. And the knee jerk was, I want to mandate we need to hire 150 new, and this is a true story, right? And I mean, anybody who's listening has been in IT or doing this stuff, you could have hundreds of these stories. So the idea that theory of knowledge at least gives you a guardrail. Because if you start off with the idea that you don't really know what you think you know, all you have is a hypothesis. Then you can sort of follow what's been successful since the scientific revolution, right? Theory, going back to, like Francis Bacon and those guys, right? Like it's how we solved almost every scientific problem, including, the vaccines for COVID, right? Like it's scientific method, right? So yes, scientific method, systems thinking. And then again, using a little bit of analytical statistics and like understanding the human element of how we deal with change. We can't just tell people to change. We got to understand what motivates them to change. Yeah, I think it's all part of almost every success, post DevOps success story that you've read, seen, or witnessed, or been involved in. Most of those, if not all of those elements, are present in that success story.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. And I read the goal back when SOA was the big thing, because what we were trying to do is tie all these stovepipe systems together because there was redundant data in each, because they were all built in a silo. And we had this one SaaS user who used to request these mammoth data sets, and they would consume so much resource. One day I sat down with the gentleman and said, what are you doing? Well, I pull this out and then I run this data set and I run that data set and there's like this process. And I said, well, what are you getting at the end? Well, I'm getting this. Why don't I just give you that? Right. And that eliminated weeks of compute power. I mean, it's kind of that system thinking is, take a step back.
That's right.
From the micro world and say, what problem are you trying to solve? Right. And then solve it more holistically. And it saved so much compute and storage and time and, right. And then the guy's freed up all his time. He was an analytics guy. He could actually do analytics now instead of running SaaS jobs his whole life. So, those types of things, and we see that in the DevOps pipelines, right? To streamline things.
Absolutely. And you know what else is really interesting, Michael, is like the whole idea of psychological safety. You can tie all that back in too, because they're like, think about 2 of the 4 elements, probably all four of the elements, again, definitely apply to psychological safety, but the idea that if you're using and living by this concept of theory of knowledge is that you don't really know what you know, and everything is sort of a hypothesis and a sort of an experiment, then that allows, the person who's been on the job for like 3 days, of sort of any diverse background to be able to raise their hand and say, I think that's going to work differently. Because if you're in a sort of a scientific mindset, some people call it engineering mindset, but you're already sort of anti-brainwashed yourself to those biases. The sort of the example without theory of knowledge and sort of theory of psychology is, the young person that 2 days says, my last job, that we had, that didn't really always work that way. And the senior person is saying, what do you know? You've only been here 3 days. Come back and talk to us in a year from now, right? The psychologically safe environment is, wow, why don't you go experiment that? See if you're right. Right? And like, again, we've learned a lot of that from like really a lot of the cloud titans and these younger kids who are engineers. In fact, a lot of them were physics people, right, who live and die by scientific thinking, right? So yeah, there's that other benefit of it sort of creates the sort of the diverse psychologically safe environments that we look, like hopefully everybody agrees we need to have success.
Fascinating stuff. We're gonna have to wrap this here, and
Sure.
we're gonna do another one. We're going to focus on Gen AI, but for today, Fascinating stuff. Tell us, where we can find the book and where we can find, I mean, you got so much content. You have a podcast, where can we find all this great stuff?
Yeah, so so John Willis, if you sort of LinkedIn with John Willis Atlanta or John Willis DevOps on LinkedIn, I've been running 2 newsletters these days. So almost everything I'm doing is LinkedIn newsletters. Sometimes I periodically point back to a blog, and I do have a podcast, but you can find everything from my LinkedIn profile, again, John Willis, Atlanta, whatever. And the one is all about Deming and profound knowledge. I try to cover anything that is sort of interesting in the ideas of system thinking and psychological safety and all those things. And then I have a new one. So I'm writing a new book. We'll talk about this probably end of this year, but
Baker's dozen, huh?
The history of AI. And so I've created another newsletter where I'm kind of thinking about all these ideas. Attention is all you need. And so those are the 2 places that I'm finding most people are responding to. That's where I'm putting most of my work.
Well, that's our show for today. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Make sure to like us, leave a review, and subscribe. You can also check out our previous episodes wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And you can always find me on Twitter, MadGreek65, or reach out to me directly via email at mcavis@deloitte.com. Feel free to give us suggestions on topics you want to hear. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on our cloud.
Thank you for listening to On Cloud for Cloud Professionals with Mike Kavis. Connect with Mike on LinkedIn and visit the Deloitte On Cloud blog at deloitte.com/US/Deloitte-on-cloud-blog. Be sure to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app. This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, go to deloitte.com/about.